Good evening. Can everyone hear me all right? I hope so. And this is our last program for the season that is completing 10 videos, and the last since we started in September 2023. And I would like to just welcome everyone who is a new member, and love to see all of you who are return members coming and watching the program. My name is Willow Elliott. I'm the past president and current vice president of the Portland chapter of NPSO. I'm going to need to put my glasses on to read my script. We promote the enjoyment, study, and protection of Oregon's native plants. That is our mission. I'd like to, as part of our mission, present a speaker every month on timely interests to our members. And our speaker tonight is Dr. Hannah Prather, presenting the forest canopy and ecosystem overhead. Let's just, I have one other announcement. Just remember not to expect us to come and be sending you any kind of a Zoom registration for July and August, because the chapter board takes a break, and so does our fearless leader, Cheryl Brock, who's our program chair. We'll see you back in September for a program with Dr. Mitch Cruzan of PSU. He's an evolutionary biologist. He's got a very interesting program for us. But first, let's review some Zoom etiquette. Your audio and video should be turned off during the program. And after the presentation, you'll be able to unmute and turn the cameras on if you wish to stay for a brief, it can sometimes be maybe 15, 20 minutes, where we can socialize. We call it either chapter chat or social time. After the presentation is a good time for new members to introduce themselves and connect with each other. If you have a question during the program, click that chat button at the bottom of your screen to type the question into the chat box. And then Hannah will address questions after the presentation. She would like you to hold your questions. I will read back the questions at the end, and be sure to check all of the ones that you have put into the chat. You may also notice a closed caption feature, which you can click on to enable it if you have any need for hearing issues. And now it's time to introduce our speaker. Dr. Hannah Prather is a National Science Foundation postdoctoral research fellow and visiting assistant professor of biology at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. And throughout her PhD and teaching career, Hannah's research has focused on the intricate relationship among lichens, mosses, host trees, and the surrounding ecosystem, all set against the dynamic backdrop of climate change and urbanization. Hannah's research has taken place around the globe, most notably in tall tree species, urban environments, and polar ecosystems. She has worked locally and internationally, guiding and teaching tree climbing research techniques, as well as spending 5 field sessions on the Western Antarctica Peninsula, where she co-led a collaborative project examining the warming effects on polar moss communities. So she's very exotic. As a longtime Oregonian and almost native Oregonian, Hannah received her PhD in biology from Portland State University and a BS from Oregon State University. She loves to share her diverse field-based experiences and methodology with her students, and hopes to foster a sense of excitement and awe for the often overlooked yet fascinating world of Pacific Northwest epiphytes, which are lichens and mosses. At Reed, Hannah teaches courses on the lichens of the Pacific Northwest, forest canopy ecophysiology, and advances in forest canopy research. She'll also tell you about the very interesting Andrews Experimental Forest, where she did some research on the Mackenzie River. Welcome, Hannah, and everyone sit back and enjoy the program.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Willow, and thank you to the Native Plant Society for hosting me. Oh my gosh, I will apologize. I live in an area where there's a train, so you may be hearing the train honking along the way. Let me go ahead and get my presentation pulled up. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. I don't see anyone, but we'll see if anyone gives a thumbs up. Oh my gosh, I wish I could see you all, but we'll wait until the end. It'll be a big surprise. But yeah, thanks again for the lovely introduction. Like I said, my name is Hannah. I currently work at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. And I'm just really excited to share with you guys this evening. Thanks for attending this part of the evening. And also, it's really exciting to be the wrap up for these talk sessions. It sounds like I'm the closer, so very exciting. But I'm really excited tonight to really tell you about a component of the ecosystem that's often overlooked in our forests. And it's actually been a really big part of my research, and that is the forest canopy and what I like to call the ecosystem over our heads. And I've actually been working and studying in canopies for over 14 years now, which I can't believe that's gone by pretty fast. But tonight I'd like to tell you a little bit about what first intrigued me about forest canopies, a little bit of the work I've done and how I've incorporated students into that work, and then a little bit of the nit and grit of what the canopy, working in the canopy looks like. So I'm hoping to kind of take you guys on that journey. For my students, I always like to give us a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going, right? So this evening, we're keeping our goals pretty simple. We're not going to have any tests or quizzes, so no stress. But really, my main goal for you guys is to generate some awe and appreciation of Northwest forest canopies. Again, it's something that's often over our head in the forest, and we may not always be thinking about all of the beautiful intricacies that are up there. And number two, I really hope that after this talk, you can then share the awesomeness of the canopy with the uninitiated, those who weren't able to attend this evening. So we'll keep it pretty basic. Just so you know a little bit about me, which might help give some context to the next bits I'll tell you about, is trees have actually always been a really big part of my life. And my love of trees goes back to my childhood. And so I actually grew up in a really rural timber town in Southern Oregon. If anyone knows Prospect, Oregon, there's a sign for our little town. And my dad was actually a nurseryman or a silviculturist, and he grew little Douglas fir seedlings, like you can see in the slide here on the lower left, for the reforestation of privately owned timberlands. And so I grew up on a really rural, large ranch. My siblings and I spent a lot of time outside, a lot of time helping my dad, and a lot of time around Douglas fir trees, which is our state tree and a tree that's really special to me. My dad took this picture of me on the right, and he likes to say that as a child, I had the confident lean of an ecologist early on. And so, in some ways, you could say, wow, well, it's no surprise that your love of trees and this background led you to study in forest canopies. But really, if I were to be more honest with you guys, growing up in a small rural Oregon town, I actually never knew that you could have a job studying in tree canopies. And so that was a really exciting thing to discover. And so as I began my academic studies in forestry and natural resources, I ended up really landing in this unique path that led me to develop a whole set of specialized skills that have allowed me now to access some of the tallest tree species on the planet and ask a lot of really cool questions. And this became a place I became really fascinated with. So here's a project I did in the Coast Redwoods. You can see my tiny little self climbing there on the left-hand side, a really beautiful area to be. And really, I just want to share this with you guys because this is my face when I'm in this space. So here's a couple different projects I worked on. But the forest canopy for me is really a place of awe. It's a place I feel very inspired as a scientist. I feel curious as a human about the things that are up there, the processes that are happening, and just so much more that we have yet to learn about this special ecosystem. And so I'm really hoping tonight that if you guys take away anything, it's that sort of awe and excitement and curiosity that this place can generate for you. A couple notable projects, just so you can see a few of the fun things that being a canopy scientist allows you to do. And a few of my life highlights were doing some work in the tropical cloud forest in Monteverde, Costa Rica. This was a project where we looked at epiphytes, so things like ferns and bromeliads that were growing in forest canopies. And then this was actually a project to look at biomass. And so we were removing some bits of these epiphytes, these massive, massive epiphytes from the trees to make some calculations on physiology. I've also gotten to do some really cool work in Sequoia and Kings National, National Parks. Sorry, I'm trying to come up with the right word. in California. And this is a newer, really exciting project where they're bringing climbers in to do some genetic banking of some of the larger groves of trees that are burning in the recent wildfires in that area. And so we came in as sort of a pilot to climb some of the stands of the trees in different severity and collect cones so that that seed could then go to a special freezer or seed bank that's at UC Berkeley. And so a lot of time climbing in some really burnt sequoia trees, collecting a lot of different types of cones. And just to add for fun, if you've never seen a group of ladybugs, this is called a loveliness of ladybugs. And inside of these burns, hiking through these burns to access these large trees for this project, parts of it feel very devastating, but I think this picture for me really reminded me of that life and regeneration is all around us in these systems as well, post these fires. So this was a very optimistic photo for me. I've also done a number of projects in the coast redwoods as well as old growth Douglas fir right here in our backyard in the Northwest, Washington and Oregon. So just a lot of great times with great teams of people working in a lot of different spaces and large tree canopies. Now, before we get too further into the weeds, it's a kind of good to remember what really is a forest canopy, and also what is a tree crown. And so I just want to orient us here with a couple terms that when we're speaking about a single tree, we're describing a tree crown. But a canopy is actually a collection of crowns. And there's this beautiful definition of a tree canopy, which here I have by Parker from 1995, is the aggregate of all crowns in a stand of vegetation, which is the combination of all the foliage, the twigs, the fine branches, the epiphytes, which I love, as well as the interstices of air. So that is the air spaces between the branches. What a beautiful definition of a canopy. And so this is really creating this collective idea that the canopy isn't just a tree, it actually is this aggregate of all of these bits of these trees, twigs, epiphytes, the air spaces between. So that can kind of help us as we move along our path in understanding tree canopies. So why do we really care about forest canopies? And particularly, why do we care about them in the Northwest? And so just to give us a little bit of history here, in Oregon and really Northwest forest as a whole, we have really abundantly productive forest lands. And this has led to a long history of this in this region of growing trees as crops. And this is also part of my childhood, right? This is kind of where I grew up. And my dad actually was laid off in the 1980s when this bird that we see here, the spotted owl, came onto the scene and halted a lot of the timber harvest at that time. And that time has now been referred to as the Timber Wars. There's a really great OPB podcast that kind of outlines. Okay, so I want to touch a little bit here about the spotted owl. And some of you might remember this time. This was a pretty tumultuous time in Northwest forest history. And so really we're thinking about in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, in this timber wars time in our history, was a time at which the creation of the Northwest Forest Plan came on in the early 90s. And what this is really a landscape approach to federally managed lands. And it was designed to protect threatened and endangered species in that region. And really kind of started to bring some light to, wow, we have these big old forests and there's these other animals and salmon and things that are relying on this forest. And so we're also like creating a plan that allows us to protect those threatened and endangered species. And so it was really crafted in response to the overharvesting of old growth forests at that time. So how do we start the shift of going from seeing Northwest forests as just crops into viewing them as these ecological wonders? And this is all, I would say, pretty recent in our timeline. In the 70s and 80s, as these bits of research were starting to come up against the timber industry to say, wait, we maybe are coming at this with a little too heavy of a hand. We started having these large clear cuts. And really, people started to protest and say, wait, we're not sure that we're okay seeing these huge cut forests without really truly understanding kind of the intricacies of the ecosystem. And so that research interest began to grow and shift in the 80s. And the more that that kind of exposed the complexities of this forest ecosystem, it became a really exciting time for forest research in our region. And really during this time, there's a shift from beginning to kind of study the individual organism, so the tree or certain bits of individual components of a forest, and more into this broader ecological understanding of how all these components work together within the forested ecosystem. So one really important area of research in the Northwest is the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. And some of you might be familiar with this. On the map in the middle, this is actually east of Eugene, Oregon. And this was really a big shift for Northwest Forest. The experimental forest was actually created in 1948 by the Forest Service and by Horace Justice Andrews, who at the time was the U.S. Forest Service Region 6 Chief Forester. And he was really a strong supporter of forest research and was directly involved in selecting this watershed. And what this is an entire experimental watershed that's been studied since this time. And in 1980, that was a really pivotal point because it also began to be designated as one of the first National Science Foundation long-term ecological research sites. And that really helped preserve that space for research. And really, again, just to reiterate, this is an early, really foundational place where a lot of forest ecology research happened in the Northwest. And it was one of the first places that people began to ask questions about the forest canopy as well. So here we can see a climber that is climbing in that in the H.J. Andrews. And I'll talk a little bit more of some of the work that's been done there. So I really love this map, and it might be a little hard for some to look at, but this is a time map. So on our x-axis on the lower bit, we have the year to date. And then we have these different sort of designations. And these are all of the different types of studies that have been done in the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. And so in red here, I've just highlighted some bits of when canopy ecology sort of came onto that time map. So, and this is just super fun to look at. But most notably, we can see in sort of this timber wars time of the 1970s and the early 1990s is when we started having some canopy ecology and some beginning studies into that realm. And then more recently in 2015 and further on, we're having more looking at canopy climate and the installation of a lot of data loggers into the canopies of these trees here. Many components of what we now know about Pacific Northwest forest ecology were documented here in the H.J. Andrews. And so, let me see if that is going to go. There we go. So as researchers spent time in the Andrews Forest, you can imagine that curiosities grew and started to think, wow, what is really up above our heads? And so there's a great story about Bill Dennison, who was an OSU botanist, who was kind of hiking around and doing work in the H.J. Andrews and started to notice these lichens and finding them on the ground and started to become really curious about where are these lichens coming from? Like they're not growing on the ground. And so it became apparent that they were falling from the upper canopy. And it was actually two women from Oregon State that figured out that they could kind of modify rock climbing gear to climb trees to then begin to explore what was up in these canopies. And what they found was that the canopy actually was an entirely different ecosystem. And they found overhead villages of animals, spotted owls, marbled murrelets, flying squirrels, and even little families of voles that haven't come down for generations out of those trees. And they also found the lichen that they had kept finding on the ground. And so this really, again, like spurred this idea of, wow, this biodiversity and interconnectedness and ecology between the canopy and the forest floor. And so if you've spent time around any old growth forest or gone on a hike in this area, you can start to know, and here these pictures are kind of showing us that old growth forests really have their own structural flavor, right? So we start to see differences between really old trees and trees which are much younger. And so what I like about this set of photos from a colleague of mine, Russell Kramer, is that we start to see what we call crowns, tree crowns that are not model conforming. So a model conforming crown would be a very like Christmas tree with a very predictable branching set. And as trees age, we get kind of this ruggedness, right? Sort of what happens to us as well as we start to accumulate some damage and we've lost some limbs and there's been a windstorm and we start to regrow these reiterations and these new tops and new limbs. And so we start to take on, the trees begin to take on a very different type of structural complexity. And this type of crown complexity is something that researchers have really focused on and identified as really lending to a lot of other ecosystem benefits when we have trees that are old and contain these really specific crown complexities. And often you can see these even from the road. And as someone who spends a lot of time in trees, I can spot them sometimes, like just driving down the road, you see those kind of gnarly tops and you know that there's some old trees over there. So this is also part of my friend Russell's work on the Olympic Peninsula, but inside of these old complex crowns, we have impressive mats and biomass of mosses and lichens. And so here's this really beautiful mat of Selaginella, which covers these large limbs in the Sitka spruce forest of the Olympic Peninsula. So just to give you an idea of when we allow these trees to become old and age, they can take on all of these complex features that lend towards all these other immense biomass of epiphytes. Another really cool component of allowing that crown complexity to form with time, and this here on the left is actually a hard picture to see, but that is a cavity that goes all the way through a tree. So you're actually seeing the other side of the airspace through there. And here on the right, we're looking at actually a fecal ring of the marbled murrelet, which I'll talk a little bit more about. This is a protected bird that needs really large limbs to nest on. And so when we have these older gnarly features and we allow decay to happen in trees, there's then creates a cycle of fungi that can come in and decay that wood, and then birds can come in and excavate these holes that now provide habitat and cavities and nesting, as well as having really immense branch sizes that allow nesting platforms for certain types of birds that need large nesting platforms. Up in these trees, we also have something really cool that most people don't know about, and that is the creation of arboreal soils. These are really special soils that are called histosols. They're soils that are just purely organic matter. And these have been documented in places like the tropics and a little bit on the peninsula, Olympic Peninsula. But most people aren't aware that with time and accumulation of all this epiphytic matter, that then we can have this decomposition that creates these arboreal soils as well. So very interesting to study. Additionally, some work from the Olympic Peninsula as well, Russell Kramer's work has showed us how important age is in the formation of these complex crowns. And so I'm just kind of highlighting this as when we have repeat areas where we're harvesting and not allowing trees to age, we're missing out on a lot of those benefits that come in that later age and complex branch structure. And so here on the x-axis, we're looking at age of tree. And we're looking at on the left, Sitka spruce and Douglas fir, on the right, those two graphs. And essentially what this is showing is just the complexity of branching, which has been categorized by these different colors, brooms, forking, epicormic branches, whatnot. And we can see that in species like Sitka spruce, they don't take quite as long to accumulate those features. But in a species like Douglas fir, we're looking at 400 plus years before we even start to accumulate a lot of those complex branching structures. So it's just kind of interesting to see how that varies by tree species and how we could also think intentionally about what types of trees are going into some forests and how that could stimulate biodiversity or these different structures in different ways as well. Okay, so I'm going to cycle back a little bit. That's just a little bit to prime us for like why these old canopies are so interesting to study. And so at H.J. Andrews today, there's still kind of this ongoing canopy work. And most of that now has been focused into work on a single tree called the Discovery tree, which is essentially a whole canopy that's been well instrumented with a MET station and different physiological instruments so that they can really understand what these trees, like temperatures and things like this, that they're being exposed to. And so in this tree, all of these wires you can see are all running from data loggers. So it's a really amazing resource to kind of document what's going on in that watershed as well. I do want to mention that, interestingly, with the series of ongoing wildfires that are happening in Oregon in particular, that the H.J. Andrews did burn with the Lookout Fire. And it looks like that was I thought that was in 2020. I don't know if I have looks like it was on September 18th. I don't see the date on there. I apologize if that's not clear. But this was a very recent fire, and the watershed here, and I apologize for the red and green, the watershed's indicated in green and the fire footprint is indicated in red. But you can see that a significant amount of this historical research forest was burned. And so now it's really exciting and interesting as well that there's kind of a new phase of this ongoing experiment that perhaps will be one more focused on the recovery and regeneration after this fire has occurred as well. Okay, so now we kind of set ourselves up with like this sort of history of the Northwest Forest Plan, the spotted owl, how that set us up to then ask these more ecological questions with the H.J. Andrews. But another really important part of canopy science in the Northwest is the Wind River Experimental Forest. And if some of you are local and are aware, this is actually located in Carson, Washington, so just sort of east and north of Portland, Oregon. And this is a really interesting site that was also created sort of in the same era in 1995, and it went until 2011 when it was defunded. But essentially, they installed a construction crane in a forest to begin to study the forest canopy. And this is a very tall, 230-foot tall crane. The tower is still there. You can still hike to it. It's a really interesting place, has beautiful lichens. And it's in an old growth forest of Western hemlock and Douglas fir. And those trees are about 500 years old. And this was one of 11 cranes that they had installed around the world and was the third one and the largest and only in a temperate coniferous forest. So pretty cool that that happened here in the Northwest. And this is just a really, boy, I'm already at almost close to time here, so I'll just touch quickly here. But really, this is an exciting site where we actually learned a lot about photosynthesis in these old tall trees. And at this time, that was really influential because there was a lot of questions around if old forests were carbon sinks or carbon sources. And so the data collected over the time period of the crane installation actually gave us a lot of support to show that in fact, old trees are incredible carbon sinks, and they're still photosynthesizing to an intense magnitude just due to the leaf area that they have alone. So I'm just going to skip through here a little bit. Here's what it looked like when it had the gondola. It had a cute little yellow gondola, and researchers and students in the area were able to come and take a ride and kind of get to go up and down and collect samples that otherwise would be very hard to collect. Here's what it looked like. But again, the tower part of this is still being utilized for some gas flux measurements. I believe it's on the NEON network, which is the National Ecological Observation Network, where it measures different gases throughout the height of that tower. But the jib is now removed as well. Okay, but one really important thing, and I should mention that this is something very close to my heart because this was a big portion of my PhD, was studying epiphytes, lichens, and mosses. And one of the most amazing things we learned from the crane research was about epiphytes. And so when I'm talking about epiphytes, I'm simply saying a plant that lives on another plant. There's no harm or sort of like negative effect to the substrate or the host plant. And these are things that have to get all of their nutrition and water from the air. So they don't have roots or a way to like interface with soils and gain that nutrition. But Bruce McCune, who's an amazing lichenologist from Oregon State University, did a lot of the work at the crane. And here he is using it to look at this cool old snag, right? That otherwise you couldn't climb that or have access to it otherwise to study the lichens on top. So a lot of what we know about the stratification, how lichens and mosses grow along these tall vertical axes of trees, and where they kind of like to hang out, if it's in the bright and dry part of the upper crown or the low, kind of moist and shady part of the lower crown, we learned from the research at the canopy crane. I always like to note that canopy epiphytes actually are really important in Northwest forests. They contribute a lot of really important roles, are often overlooked because they're these little kind of scrappy bits that are hanging out in these old forest canopies, but they're really important for things like nutrient cycling. Some of these lichens can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and make that nitrogen available as almost like a fertilizer for the forest when it falls to the ground. And they're important in things like the sort of micro uh, microclimate of the canopy as well. So sequestering water and then releasing that slowly back out. So some cooling benefits, as well as being kind of a nesting and forage source for birds as well. And I just have to note that lichens are incredibly beautiful and charismatic parts of Northwest forests. They have many different colors and shapes, and they are just really a fun group to dive into. So I hope it can get your curiosity going about that a little bit. But people always ask, even though I mostly study the lichens and mosses in these trees, what about the birds and the animals? And so I've tried to add a couple bits in here to sort of like satiate the people that have the bird and animal interests. And so some of the most notable birds of Northwest canopies, because there's many that are utilizing the canopy, would be the northern spotted owl and the marbled murrelet, which I've noted already. The northern spotted owl, of course, is a really important bird in our forest. It primarily lives in old growth forests, and it likes to nest in cavities or platforms of particularly large trees. And it also prefers rodents, things like the red tree vole or the northern flying squirrel, which are also pretty dependent on large trees. And this was a species that became threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1990, and it was noted that the loss of old growth habitat was one of the primary threats. And then additionally, you might have heard of the marbled murrelet. It's also known as the flying yam. This is a seabird that nests in coastal ancient forests. They were federally listed as threatened in 1992, also noted as loss of old growth habitat as a source there. But they are the ones that need kind of large nesting platforms. It spends a lot of its time at sea, but it actually is somewhat of a poor flyer, as I've heard, called the flying yam. So they actually need really big canopies so that as they come in from the sea, they can kind of have like a wide landing area. So if you just think about the spacing that happens in those old crowns versus the shrubbiness of younger trees, part of what it needs is kind of that large older crown so it can kind of have a runway to come into its nesting area. And it's always fun to talk about the little mammals that also utilize this arboreal or this canopy space. And so I actually found this great paper that someone wrote about the arborality. So this is like the amount or a scale that mammals use the canopy. So with the idea that, so this scientist created a scale of 0 to 12. So if you're a 12, you are in the canopy all the time. You never would access the ground. And if you're a 0, you would never use the canopy and you would only be on the ground. And then there's a number of things that are sort of in between, as you can imagine, many squirrels and things like that. And so here, I'd like to introduce you to the most arboreal animal in the Northwest, which is the red tree vole. It's a number 12 on the arborality scale. And it's just an adorable little vole that spends all of its time up in Douglas fir canopies. I don't believe that it occurs north of the Columbia River. I think that's sort of a dispersal limitation there. But it actually eats bits of the Douglas fir needles, and then it has to drink all of its water from the dew that accumulates in the canopy. It's an adorable animal. And then we have a number of things like the western gray squirrel, the northern flying squirrel, Douglas's squirrel, and the dusky-footed wood rat, which all range between a 7 to 8 on the arborality scale, meaning that they use the canopy quite a bit for things like food or fleeing from predators, but they also access the ground as well. But a couple really important things here. The northern flying squirrel is a mycophagous, so it specializes on eating fungi and particularly these like little truffles that grow on the tree roots of trees. And it's really important because it actually is been shown to be responsible for dispersing this fungi to other trees. And this can be a mycorrhizal fungi that sort of helps benefits the growth of trees. And again, the northern flying squirrel and the red trevel are important forage sources of the spotted owl. So just kind of seeing this connectedness here. Okay, I'm just keeping my eye on my time. I always tend to go a little bit over. So just a little bit of a recap here, and mostly what I want to kind of highlight here is that when we think about tree canopies, we're not just thinking about trees, right? We're thinking about all these various organisms that associate with these trees and help kind of stimulate the habitat and connectivity of these ecosystems. And so, like I had mentioned, it's really important as trees age that then these complex crown features come on, and decay is really important. So having those wood decaying fungi that then make way for birds and things to excavate out portions of those canopies that now leave habitat availability for these little mammals to also nest or for other birds to nest. The epiphytes like lichens and mosses are really important for a lot of the nesting materials and insulation for birds and for those little mammals as well. So I'll just kind of in really starting to see the connectedness of all these different components and that we're thinking here at the bottom, we're not just thinking of the structure of a tree alone, we're really thinking about the processes, the functions that all are interconnected within this system. I don't want to leave out the amphibians because these are also super cool. It's easy to focus on the really charismatic things, but this guy's also pretty charismatic. This is the wandering salamander. It's very small. It's only about 4 inches in length. And this has particularly been found in the coast redwood trees, but it actually lives its entire life in the crowns of coast redwood. And researchers discovered that it has this really cool adaptation that it can sort of spread out and parachute and in case it does fall out of the tree and it will sort of glide slowly back down to the ground. So pretty special. And then, of course, for the invertebrate lovers, oh my goodness, this is often a really big overlooked part of the canopy biodiversity. But there's been a lot done in the H.J. Andrews looking at these tiny little microinvertebrates, things like mites and columba that live inside of the moss and lichens. And here we have a tardigrade, also something very common in these epiphytic mats. And researchers from OSU did a study exploring the mites in H.J. Andrews and found that as little as 6 feet off of the ground, they find very distinct different communities. So the things that are soil dwelling are very different than the things that are arboreal dwelling. So much biodiversity. These are tiny little things that you can hardly see with your eye. And so just an exciting component of that biodiversity. Okay, I think we're getting pretty close to time. I'm gonna try to zip through these next ones pretty fast.
Actually, Hannah, you can go on for another 15 minutes if you'd like. I bet you
Oh,
have.
wonderful. Okay, great.
Sure.
I guess I was going from 7, but you're right, we
Seven.
started a little bit after.
Yeah, we can go 10
Wonderful.
minutes.
Okay,
Does
perfect. I
anyone
think
have any?
that'll place us nicely for the slides I have left.
Sure.
So at this bit, I just want to transition a little bit into a little bit more of the work I've done and what canopy research really looks like for me as someone who's practicing this for my own research and with students. And so one really cool thing to note is that actually a lot of canopy science has been done by women. And a lot of the pioneers of this stuff, Dr. Nalini Nadkarni and Dr. Meg Lauman, are women that started doing this with sewing their own harnesses out of like seatbelt material in a time when women weren't really doing this. So a really awesome just component I like to highlight about this. And now I feel like I'm surrounded by wonderful, brilliant women that are running research programs in these trees. And so a few of the people I've been lucky enough to work with is Sybil Gotch, who just started at the University of Kentucky after being at Franklin and Marshall for a number of years. She's done some amazing work in the cloud forest of Monteverde. Dr. Rike is an amazing lichenologist who's done so much work in the coast redwood and has found so many new species just by climbing and spending hours in single redwood trees. So beautiful contribution of work. Wendy Baxter is an amazing climber and physiologist who works on giant sequoia. And they have a lot of ongoing work right now, of course, looking at drought and fire stressors for those trees. And Dr. Skyland is at Oregon State, an amazing pathologist looking at things like Swiss needle cast and a few other different pathogens. So just a really inspiring group of people to be around just to kind of orient where some of the work is going. And then, of course, I get to take my students into the canopy, which has really been a wonderful kind of full circle thing for me to share as well. And so Reed is a pretty exciting place that allows a lot of freedom to take students into these types of things. So here we have a tree that's rigged up outside of our biology building, teaching students how to do tree access in a safe way so that they can ask questions. And then these students on the side are a couple of our thesis students who have done special focused projects asking questions in the canopy. So you might be wondering, well, how do you get into these canopies now that we know that they're so cool and there's so many neat things to study? And so actually there's a number of different ways that researchers have used across the years. And one, of course, is being rope-based systems of climbing. But of course, there's also places where they've used towers installed. Of course, we mentioned the construction cranes that have been installed around the globe in different forest types. Dr. Meg Lauman here on the lower right has done a really cool project installing canopy walkways to allow people of all different accessibilities to get into canopies. They even have flown blimps with this thing called the canopy raft below it, which looks terrifying to me. But essentially, like researchers could scurry around on that raft and like collect leaves. I think I would rather be hooked onto a rope or on a tower, but just super exciting stuff. And then below in the middle, people have even used rifles to shoot branches out of trees. So depending on your question, getting the branch to come to you might be an easier method of access too. So I have to say, I put this photo in here. This is borrowed from the internet, but I always think when I started doing canopy work, I thought, boy, this would be me. I'll be perched on the top of a tree with my binoculars, like scoping out, the forest, looking very regal. But what does canopy research really look like? Is it this? And for me, what's turned out is it actually looks a lot more like this. So I spend a lot of time in the less glamorous part, which is just carrying a lot of ropes and a lot of bags around the forest. And so that's been a big part of my work is to do canopy access and also ask scientific questions. You need a lot of things. And so you have to have all of your climbing gear and be thinking like a climber in one hat. And then you have to have all of your research gear, instrumentation, be thinking like that researcher in the other hat. So a lot of our work is just getting really strong people to help us carry things around the forest. And then after we carry the things, we eat a lot of things because then we're very hungry. So here's just a couple of fun photos of some canopy fun. My friend Seth in the middle surprised me. We got to the top of this tree. We've been working really hard. It's a hot day. And he pulls out this Trader Joe's bag and starts to scoop out yogurt and granola and makes himself a yogurt parfait in the top of a tree. And then my postdoc advisor's hand is in the far right there holding a burrito as a success after we rigged this tree with some new rigging. So always time to eat, even when you're in a tree. We also do a lot on the ground and we learn the importance of having a good science tarp. So we often are setting up and staging our equipment or the types of things that we're going to have laid out to do the experiments that we're going to do. And so a good ground tarp is an important part of every scientist's canopy scientist kit as well. We use a lot of different rope climbing techniques, but to work in tall conifers, we use techniques that have been kind of adapted from caving. So we're actually climbing the rope, not the tree itself. And so here's a couple different projects with different fun folks that kind of are showing those types of single rope techniques or what those are called. And we spend a lot of time studying lines. And so we use really fancy and fun equipment like this 8-foot tall slingshot or a modified crossbow to shoot lines really high into tall trees to give us the highest access point that we can possibly get. And we spend a lot of time coiling ropes. Another highlight of anyone who's done rope-based work, you spend a lot of time with a lot of patients. And if you've ever wondered what a 600-foot mountaineer's coil looks like on somebody's body, that is my friend Junior, who has way too much rope around his neck for comfort. But that's what you got to do sometimes for those long lines. And of course, in the Northwest, you get really wet, and that doesn't always work out. The weather doesn't always cooperate with the questions of the day as well. So a lot of time getting pretty wet and having a lot of rope gear that gets wet, and then that leads to the drying of the wet gear. And so here's our lab, which is completely engulfed in ropes after a pretty wet climbing session. And the fun part is we get to come up with a lot of unique methods. So I like to say I also have a PhD in zip tie. That's a very common tool that we use to install things into these canopies, as well as getting to explore a lot of different adaptations of how to use things in a really three-dimensional space when you're hanging on a rope. We often bring things from the canopy to the ground. So here's a group of students that are making a measure of water potential. This is essentially like how water stress a leaf would be from the upper parts of the trees. And so we don't always take everything up into the tree. At times we bring things down. And we also can bring them back to the lab. So here's some beautiful lichens that we've been looking at as well from these canopies. But what I hope you guys take away the most is just the fun that can be had through this ecosystem, the awe of all of the different biodiversity and structural complexities that these old trees hold. And I hope that the next time that you're out hiking around, you have a little bit more idea or knowledge of like what could be overhead and kind of understand some bits of that. So I think this is my last slide. This is a beautiful sunset from a tree near Mount Tabor. That's actually the Mount Tabor Reservoir right below there. And so with that, I will go ahead and take any questions. Or Willow, I'm not sure if you want to field the questions.
Yeah, well, here's what happened. I had been writing down the chat questions, and lucky because then I lost my internet connection and
Oh,
half of them have disappeared. But let's
I
see
might
if
be
I
able
can
to see
start
them
with,
on my.
I can actually, I wrote down at the beginning Alan's question, and I have everyone's questions through Inga Winters that I can read back. Or can you see them now? Can you see the chat now yourself, Hannah?
Yes, I think so.
It
Yes,
starts
okay,
with
I
a
think I
question from
see.
Alan Bennett about if you ever worked with Robert Van Pelt.
Oh, I haven't worked directly with Bob Van Pelt. I'm a huge fan of his work and especially his drawings as well. But I've worked adjacent with groups of people who have worked closely with Robert, like Steve Stillett's group, Russell Kramer. But I haven't worked directly with Bob, but I'm a huge fan.
Okay.
And thanks for the earring compliment. These are actually from one of my thesis students who just
Oh,
graduated.
right. Yeah. So do you want to go ahead and just read the questions? Can you read? Are they too tall? Is it too small?
No, yeah, I could read these. Let's see. Was the National Science Foundation already researching the forestry before the Andrews? Um, I don't know that the National Science Foundation was, but I know that when Horace Justice Andrew created, it did have research being done at that time.
Hmm.
But I don't think that was directly with the National Science Foundation at the H.G. Andrews. That was Willow's question. Wonderful. Thanks to the Alicia. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but thank you for the comment. Does climbing in the trees damage them in any way? Ooh, good question, Caroline. We always do our best to limit that as much as we can. We're not using spikes or anything like that that goes into the tree. And like I said, we often use a lot of protective measurements. Like we're climbing the rope in the SRT system, so to tall conifers. And there are some other rope systems where we use like cambium saver that sort of protects any sort of wear. But I will say that it does do impact, and that is something that we try to be really thoughtful about. And sometimes that's even maybe limiting our sample size so that we're not in as many of the old trees, but we're sort of focusing on on staying in a more limited number. It can be really easy to knock off mosses and lichens. And so that there are people who do recreational tree climbing, and sometimes in really old trees, I makes me feel kind of sad because it's really hard to not do some damage to these communities that have been there for hundreds of years forming. So just something to be aware of, that it's best to always follow the regulations and rules, and things like the redwoods, you're not allowed to climb without a research permit. And that is really, set up to protect the delicate, or like the delicate parts of those canopies as well. So yeah, good question. Oh, and then Susan shared the Lookout Fire was 2023. Oh, wow, that recent. Okay. There was just so many in those Labor Day fires the years prior. I always get the dates of them a little bit. It's great. Okay, and then we also have Caitlin. Does the distance between trees dictate if a population of trees form a canopy? I'm thinking of an old growth oak savanna that typically are widely spaced, and the conifers are most deciduous like big maple. Okay, cool. And then you worked at Neon. Cool. And still, oh, at Wind River. Awesome. Oh, I love that. I still take my students there and to do a field trip to always just kind of calibrate us to like what's been done and the history there. It's such a neat spot, the crane spot. I don't know off the top of my head, I don't know of anything about the distance between trees as far as like um how they form the if that's part of the definition.
And how about the deciduous trees? Does anybody study that?
I'm still phenotypically white and the conifers most often seen. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So hard to not hear someone verbalize it. Sorry if I'm being a little hung up there.
Do you want her to turn her voice on? Do you want her to unmute?
Sure. Yeah. If she's still on, that's fine.
Is
I'm
that
not super sure. I'm thinking of a lot of different factors of like site, so things like competition within a site, and just sort of the difference between like the oak savanna versus like maybe the more coastal northwest forest. But yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer for that one, if there's like one kind of driving component that determines like the spacing between a canopy. I would imagine there's sort of environmental drivers there as well.
Hmm.
And then let's see, David says, I recall a logger on the coast redwoods tell us back about 1960 that the coast redwood forest at Humboldt was a virtual desert, especially in the crown.
Hmm.
Interesting. I
Uh,
don't know much about that. That's as far as like no epiphytes in the crown, I'm assuming is what that means. I know that, and sorry, I'm thinking about David's question. I know that Steve Sillett and his partner are working on looking at second growth coast redwood, and if they can sort of rehabilitate the epiphytic ferns into those canopies. And so that's like it's a project they're working on called PET trees or PET trees. So looking at, because so much of the old growth coast redwood has been logged, something like less than 5% of that forest remains. Most of the redwoods now are second growth. And so they're looking at identifying potential elder trees, is what PET stands for. And in part of that, they're trying to see if they can structurally create, like go in and prune in a way that might stimulate some more complex crown features that then give way to the epiphyte habitat. And then they're also bringing the epiphytic ferns into these PET trees and attaching them and seeing if they do well being transplanted. So yeah, I don't know much about any, if there's like sort of epiphyte deserts in some of those trees, but certainly if there's second growth, that could be likely. That stuff takes a long time to kind of come back.
mhm. Well, he just added another note in the chat that he believes that this man who was teaching them was coming from a different viewpoint as a logger. That they're all just
I
you
see.
know a desert anyway. We can go ahead and
Right. Yeah, and that was kind of
they're
that
dead.
time also
The
there's in
rock.
that Timber Wars time, I had mentioned there's a really great OPB podcast series on that. But they, kind of have this, even the loggers' opinion of, and that's a very, not referring to all loggers, but this opinion that like dead and downed wood in forest was just like a hazard to loggers. And so it just needed to get cleared out because it made it really difficult for a logger to walk around. And now we know, oh my gosh, dead and downed wood is really important. It sequesters a lot of water, and that's really important in these forests, right? So it's just kind of interesting to think about, yeah, those kind of how you view the ecosystem based on maybe how you're utilizing it as well. Okay, so let's see if there's are there any lichens and mosses that are a parasite or harmful to trees? I'm thinking of my elderly. Oh, good question. No, there's no moss or lichen species, but I've heard this from people. I actually visited on one of the San Juan Islands, and I visited this woman who had sort of a prize apple orchard. And she proudly told me that she goes out every year and scrubs all the lichens and mosses off with a scrub brush. And I was like, oh my gosh, because someone had told her that they actually were detrimental for the trees. And so she thought she was taking good care of the trees. But mosses and lichens are truly just using the tree as a place to live. They don't have any sort of like direct interception with the host tree at all. And they're actually pretty beneficial. They have a lot of little tiny microvertebrates in them. They hold a lot of water. They're essentially like a little sponge, so they can soak up a lot of water from a rain event, and then they hold that water and very slowly release it back to the ecosystem. And so that really helps with cooling of those plant leaves. And yeah, they're just beautiful to look at. So yeah, there's not any known sort of like harmful effects. Wonderful. Thank you all for attending. Great. And if anyone else has a question, Willow, is it okay? I'm happy for people to turn on their.
Sure. Everyone in, let's see, I think Cheryl needs to allow everyone to then unmute and turn on their video if you would like. You don't have to, and if you don't, you just want to listen in on our conversation. Anyone?
A wonderful show, Hannah.
That's
Really
so good.
appreciate that. Done a lot of rope work myself in caves, so yeah, so I was reminiscing.
And they copied you again, Frank.
What's that?
They copied you again.
Oh,
The cavers.
yeah.
Right. Hey, Caitlin, are you still there? And if you wanted to if you wanted to reword your question, let's see, is Caitlin still there? Yeah, she is.
Oh, I'm here.
Yeah. Did you want to reword your question about those, the deciduous trees and the distance between them and different? Are you just wondering if there is such a thing as a deciduous tree canopy?
Yeah, I just noticed there was a focus on conifers in the presentation, so I was just wondering if deciduous trees play a factor at all, or if just because they don't quite live as long, if that's why they don't contribute as much as the conifer would.
I see. Yeah, I was very conifer biased. You are correct. But okay, now this makes a little more sense now that I'm reading it and hearing you say it. So yeah, one thing I liked your question about the distance between, like if you are more spaced out, are you then a connected canopy? That's a great question. I don't think I have a good answer for that. But the term canopy can also be applied to deciduous trees. So any sort of, again, that kind of overarching canopy is also widely used. We even call the mosses a moss canopy. So think about it even on that little
Oh, cool.
micro scale as well. But certainly this could apply to deciduous forests as well. And often we have many species in even a coniferous canopy, right? You have sort of like your understory species. And so that can be at different sort of layers as well, vertical layers. So great question. Yeah. But yeah, I like the question. I don't know if I have a good answer for the distance. I'd have to look and see if someone has sort of defined that or described that.
Right.
Yeah, I've just heard so much about oaks, and they live quite a long time, and they get very interesting shaped canopies as well, or I guess I shouldn't say canopies, but crowns. And so I was just curious if there's enough oaks in a savanna, and if they were close enough, that would be considered a canopy or not.
Some of those
But they're not.
junipers those junipers over in Central Oregon are so massive.
Yeah.
Did you ever climb a juniper? Well, it's much easier to climb a fir that has these nice big wide branches. And did you ever see a murrelet nest when you were up there on the coast?
No,
They're
I never have.
they're really
Um,
tiny.
but the friends that have worked in the redwoods have seen them more often.
Mhm.
I've been in areas, we had a study in, oh, I'm blanking on Willapa Bay, if you guys know where that is on the
Yeah.
coast of
Mhm.
Washington, Oregon,
Mhm.
where we couldn't climb because they have seasonal restrictions. They don't allow you to climb if it's an active murrelet nesting season. So I think it's like from April to October. So it's like most of the summer months, they won't allow you to climb if you're within a certain distance of the coast.
Oh. Let's see. Let's see. Megan is telling us about Dr. Carrie Wood's lab at the University of Puget Sound. Big leaf maple canopies on the Olympic Peninsula. Well, those are giant,
and very old.
Yeah.
super
Some
old.
some get up to 800 years old.
800-year-old big leaf maples, Alan?
Yeah, yes.
Wow. There's a
That's
can't,
that's
there's
that's Osa. I mean, that's the Olympic rainforest where
well, sure.
there's ash and
Wow.
water and salmon. So
Oh, it's incredible. Sure.
I did want to.
Inga, did you want to say something? You have your video on, your camera on?
Oh, not really. This was really cool. I like to hike and wildflowers and all that sort of thing, but also see we sometimes notice the little red thingies on the lichens, the fruiting
Oh,
and all that. It's
Yeah.
so cool. And
yes.
so hearing you talk, of course, on the hikes you don't get up there on the tree, but
Well, there is a way. Would you like
yeah.
to go on if there was a lichen ID out in the forest, or even you can walk around the city block and see lichens.
Hmm. Yeah.
There is a possibility we can
Oh
get
yeah.
a lichen ID workshop, and I think Dr. Jesse Miller is thinking about having another one. Is that right, Hannah, at Reed College?
Yeah, Jesse, and hopefully you guys caught Jesse's talk. Jesse's wonderful, amazing lichenologist. Oh my gosh. We did a lichen workshop, an identification workshop, 2-day workshop at Reed last fall, and we're going to repeat it this fall. I believe we have it scheduled for October. So if anyone's
Mhm.
interested in that, it's 2 pretty intense days. We do have a field trip where we go. Last time we actually went to the Wind River Crane because there's a really neat Oregon ash swamp where there's all these beautiful cyanolichens, and then you can kind of get into the older growth stand that has a lot of lobarias and things like that too.
Yeah.
Um, and then a lot of time with the microscopes where you get to kind of learn how to identify the features and use the chemical spot tests. So that's coming up this fall if anyone is
Well,
interested.
how would someone know about it if they're not a Reed College student? How do you find out about some of the
Yeah, I
workshops?
know that
They're open to the public. How do they
it is
publish?
open to the public. Yeah. I'm trying to last year we did advertise it in a number of different ways.
Mhm.
So even like you guys could share it if you wanted,
We,
or
yeah,
we
if
could share it.
if Jesse would send it to you or me, just to get that in our newsletter a month ahead of time, if you
Yeah,
know
okay,
what the date
wonderful.
is by September or October, whenever, would be
Yeah.
happy to share that, because sometimes Johnson Creek, if you look for your local watershed council, they're starting to do those kinds of hikes. There's so much interest in the lichens right now. Johnson Creek Watershed Council does one every year, and it's usually in October. It's cold, it's wet, and that's when they're happy. Did you want to mention these pixie lichens that Inga's talking about? And oh, then Karen has her
Yeah.
hand up.
The
Anyone else who wants to ask a question, raise your hand with your emoji things down at the bottom. Um,
and then is it Inga? Is that how you pronounce it? Those are
right,
the little
Inga.
cladonias. The little kind of they're called fruticose, but they're kind of like a little um
Hi.
Yeah, a
Pipe.
little pipe. They have a lot of different morphologies. They can have a little pixie cup on it, or they can have the little red cap or a brown cap, or they can kind of have multiple reiterations where they have like a cup and then they reiterate off the cup with another cup. So they're a beautiful genera to look at, really beautiful, often at the base of conifers or on the wet soil too.
Uh-huh.
Mhm. Right. And if you bring around a little, if you carry, when you could just entertain yourself by walking around with that magnifying glass and go
Yeah,
up
I
and
was
look at,
just thinking another thing
and
to
just
pack.
everybody who's in the park will look at you like, what is she doing? She's staring at the tree with a magnifying glass. And then you can actually see these structures on
Yes.
the three main lichens we have are growing on trees and some grow on rocks, is what I was taught. Let's see what Karen would like to ask.
Hello, hi.
Hey.
So, I moved out here from the East Coast, from the Northeast,
Okay.
and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I started doing it when I moved out here as a way of learning about the forest more. And I did Shinrin Yoku, forest bathing. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And
We've
what are
heard
your
about
thoughts
it.
about it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I am. I am.
Uh,
You want to tell
it
us
the,
about it?
Shinrin Yoku is the idea that the forest heals itself, and that trees will
Mhm.
move towards other trees that seem to be in some sort of distress. And so Shinrin Yoku is the idea of you go in the forest. It's kind of almost like a yoga in the forest. And so it was just pretty amazing because we would walk for a couple of minutes or 5 to 10 minutes and just use one of our senses. So it might just be our smell. It might be just listening. And it was really fascinating as a way of really feeling a connection, a mind body connection to the forest. And I really found that really just fascinating coming from New York City.
Uh-huh.
But, and
Yeah.
I
And
love
where
it. And I
where
live in the
were
forest
were you
now,
in
as you can
Oregon?
see.
Were,
Yeah.
were you in
So
Oregon when you did that?
when I did that, I was living in Eastmoreland actually.
Okay. Yeah.
But I was doing it through Meetup. So there is
Mm-hmm.
a group that does forest bathing.
Mm-hmm.
And now I live up in the forest. I'm up on Livingston Mountain, up in north of Camas, at
Oh,
about
okay.
1,600 feet. And so it's
Wow.
just amazing just what being in the forest
Good for you.
does
Good for
for
you.
you.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
I really applaud everybody who's helping to preserve this because it's really pretty
Yes.
amazing. So thank
True.
you.
Yeah,
You
I
got to
love,
save
thanks
what.
for sharing that, Karen. I just love those. When I was a kid too, my dad would really was an avid birder. And so anytime we were out, he'd be like, let's just sit for 1 minute and not make any sound. And so as a
Mm-hmm.
kid, I just was like, oh, dad. But then I
Mm-hmm.
realized, now that's something I keep with me, but we often do that in our classes too, just to bring our senses into our science, because you have to be good at natural history observation too, to kind of like take note. And so that's been a really fun thing that I think students really enjoy too, is just time outside where we're just quiet and we're smelling, we're listening, we're looking, we're feeling how wet the soil is, we're making note of where the
Mm-hmm.
sun is in the sky, things like that. So I love that. It's very healing, I think, for humans, and also it's a really strong science skill too.
So the other question I have is, if you don't mind me asking another one, is
Sure.
um, does the curriculum in middle and high school really touch upon the forests outside of just places like Oregon and Washington? Because I was director of math and science for New York City schools,
No.
and the answer was no. I mean, I
Right.
can tell you that it really wasn't a big feature, and it just seems like it's something that everybody should be, connecting to rather than just people living in forest areas.
Mm.
I found the same thing
Well,
in California.
well, we have an educator here. Do you want to try to answer that question, Lisa?
Well, it's quite mixed by district. I mean,
Okay,
obviously, outdoor school tries, in
obviously.
their part. And now that we have outdoor school for all, more students are getting, you know, exposed to that, but also with limited amount of time because instead of going for 5 days, they go for 3.
Right.
The other thing is, I know that I teach in a lot of the outer districts, like Sandy, Estacada, Colton, Malala, Lake
Mm-hmm.
Oswego, and I know that they definitely do field trips and stuff to some of the local forests. Um, so I think that there's more of it as far as the urban districts, maybe more so with like just planting trees and just kind of looking at trees in general as a habitat rather than the whole ecosystem or nutrient cycling.
I'm thinking more of the curriculum part of it. Like if it's something that is specifically included by cities and states, I would say even a state mandate, is to have it as part of the actual curriculum. So it's part of the curriculum in every
Well, again,
state.
so when I did my master's, I guess at this point it's 10 years ago, the next generation science standards were coming on. And certainly in those science standards, yes, there are plenty of opportunities for, like I said, nutrient cycling, and that was put in the curriculum. However, I have taught in many districts that had rolled out their own curriculum. Okay. And so hadn't even gotten to the next gen science standards. I mean, probably now they're there, but it was a slow rollout. And again, it's really district by district. Oregon does have some mandates, but I couldn't say specifically what they are. Great question. I wish there were more. And
I just worry about, the connection that children outside of Oregon get, like in New York City, there's a large population. There's a lot of financial things coming out of there. It would be great if they would be leaning towards helping us preserve forests.
Of course. It seems like from watching what's going on with grandchildren right now, my grandchildren are from 4th to 8th grade almost, and it seems like they start more of an environmental education around 5th grade. That's when they're very open. Is that correct, Lisa? Do we start?
Right, because 5th grade has, 4th grade studies Oregon. So I really kind of think they're kind of prompted more in 4th grade, but 5th grade, then they get to take some field trips and stuff. And then 6th grade, they have the outdoor school. And as far as the curriculum in the elementary schools, which is where science is really lacking, they do a lot of mystery science. And they have some really good lessons with Mystery Doug. But again, it's very video based.
Oh, I see. They're not outside. But didn't I hear that Lake Oswego makes their middle schoolers go for 1 week to what's called wilderness camp?
I don't know a difference between wilderness camp and outdoor school.
Outdoor school, well, they actually go to cabins where they cannot take their phone. There is no signal.
But that's outdoor school.
Oh, is it?
That's outdoor school. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Cool.
And they work a lot with Tryon Creek. See, Lake Oswego has a park and a facility and people that they can connect with. And so I think that's really important. Is having those nearby connections.
Yeah. I was going to maybe, Hannah doesn't know this, but Lewis and Clark College has a whole week called Moss Appreciation Week. Do you know this? In April. Yes, and they have a moss cam so that they can keep an eye on it right in one of the trees on the campus. And then Dr. John Christie heads up this whole thing. So it's crazy. It's crazy wild. Yeah. They have a moss petting zoo in the lobby.
Oh God, that's hysterical.
Oh my God.
It is. I go there every year because it's just such a hoot. And all these really serious Lewis and Clark law students or science students or whatever are walking by and going, "Did you see that? Wait, I have to go touch that." He makes a whole quilt on the wall out of lichens or out of mosses, all the different colors too.
I have to ask
This is a doctor. A botanist. What is his degree? I'm not sure, but he's an incredible ecologist who's worked all over Oregon so many times, and he's the herbarium director now at PSU.
John, right? John Christie?
Yeah, John Christie.
I do know him. Yeah, he's amazing. And he actually identified a bunch of mosses from Antarctica that we brought back because and yeah, I mean, just really challenging. And he got the flora so he could
Mhm.
identify it. And I think that it's actually really hard because there's like you can use ones from different kind of
Uh-huh.
like the Chilean one will also kind of work for some of the species that are on
Crazy.
the list. So it was really challenging. But John's amazing. I can't believe I don't know about this. And we
Yeah,
have
the
one
moss
possible at
appreciation week.
Reed. Oh my gosh.
Um, it's always right around Earth Day. And
Okay.
I forget that they're doing it again because we have a Native Plant Appreciation Month for all of April. It's either the first, second, or third week of April, and you could just look on Lewis and Clark's schedule because
Okay.
these kids get um, credit for for writing poems about moss, for creating sticker designs. They really get into it,
Oh, that's
and
so
I love it
fun.
so
Well,
much.
well, I didn't know about that either, other than you did mention it this year. So we will definitely
Uh,
need to go. Lewis and Clark is my alma mater.
yeah, you should
And
know about this.
I actually um, got started in even looking at plants and stuff along with my education degree in the forests around Lewis and Clark. And
Yeah.
my study, what I discovered is that I aged a bunch of the trees based on the fact that they had actually come down in the Columbus Day storm.
Oh,
And
wow.
so that was kind of cool, that I observed and made those things. So I spent a lot of time in those
Uh-huh.
woods. I know Cloudy grew up around there and she spent a lot of time in
Well,
those woods as well.
yeah, that's just like Reed. It's surrounded by a beautiful forest. And
Yeah.
isn't there a creek that's going through there? It's not Tryon, is it? It's going in the
No,
back
it
of,
it goes straight down. I mean, the any
oh,
creeks go straight down, or on
okay.
the other side may end up a Tryon. So, okay,
Um,
Moss is next April. And
yes.
Hannah, thank you too for the shout out about lichens. So I look forward to looking into that October bit at Reed.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
Jesse.
looking forward to
Jesse
it.
has moved to Portland now. He was living in California and traveling a lot more. So I think he promised he's going to give us an ID walk. Can you remind him about that, Hannah?
I will. Yeah, because we're supposed to chat soon about the
He was
yeah, and
trying to
if you guys
move
can
his,
come, we just had so much fun.
yeah.
We had a really fun time with the group we had last fall, so we're really excited to do it again. So if you have any like
Okay.
and interest, you'd have a great time.
Well, yeah, it's a deep study. You could just spend the rest of your life just looking in
Yeah.
under
Does Bruce?
microscopes at these things.
I did have one question for Hannah
Sure.
based on
Go ahead.
something that Bob Van Pelt told me back in the 1990s when he was just starting to switch over from measuring with ropes and cameras to laser. And that brought up the question, the adaptability of new technology and how it can really expand and increase the precision that we've done things for maybe centuries, but it was really by guess or by golly, uh, and really refine it. He puts out
Oh, I love that book.
uh, this is this is 20 years, 25 years old, and uh, he was just expanding. One of the concerns he had was that, and he was I mean, his artwork is beautiful, and he's an outdoor person. He says he truly has never worked a day in his life because he took his two greatest loves and put them together and is making money and making people happy. But he had a concern in that he was concerned that his success in finding big trees and being really excited about it, there's a subculture.
Mhm.
This book is there's like five after this one. It's uh, he's got an operation that is in all 50 states finding, and he will even find the biggest wine sap apple tree and measure
Uh,
it.
oh,
So
he's
he's
looking for
got,
the champion trees.
Yeah.
yes,
Right. I think this man, I saw one of his videos, one of his.
Yeah, he's incredible. That book that Alan is showing is,
What's the
yeah,
name
like
of
you said, what,
what's the
25
name
years
of the
old.
author again? Who's the scientist?
Robert Van Pelt, P-E-L-T.
Okay, okay.
And
And
I think the book
it's
now is like very expensive because it has been out of print. And so to try to get one, it's like, I don't know, over $100 or something, I think on,
Mhm.
yeah, but it's an amazing book where he's documented by the species,
but
like
he's
measured
putting
them.
stuff online. It is going online. So
Oh, cool. Okay.
but there, I don't know. I don't think there's a tree that hasn't been identified by his organization on the North American continent.
Huh.
Uh,
Yeah. Well, I know that he works a lot with Steve Sillett, and who's also a big tree enthusiast, particularly with finding the biggest redwoods. And but I know, like you had mentioned, that they are now combining some technology. If you guys are familiar with LiDAR, I think it stands
Yeah,
for Light
yeah,
Detection and Range System or something.
right.
But it's a type of data they can collect by flying an airplane over stands of things, and it sends down like a laser, I think it is, and it does a vertical profiling of things. So you could do like buildings or trees. And there can be some error in there, like depending if things are on a slope or like what it's determining as the low ping versus the high ping. But I know that with the LiDAR data sets that they're getting and people are combing through those, that they actually have just found in the last 2 years the tallest Doug fir. And I think they found, oh, I don't know. I just went to one of Steve's talks and they're like finding new, really tall trees that they haven't known until they've had the
Was it
LiDAR.
in was it in
and what
Washington State?
Yeah, they've been in Washington and Oregon, and I think they found a red or a Doug fir that's essentially as tall as a redwood, I think is what
Wow.
he had mentioned. But Sitka spruce, Doug fir, I can't remember the other one that they had looked at, but it is incredible with this technology now. It takes a lot of data cleaning and a lot of bushwhacking, of course, too, on the ground to
Mhm.
sort of like ground truth and find the trees. But
yeah.
yeah, a lot of
One
the
of
work that Bob has done has informed a lot of that with the allometric equations and things.
Bob's
Go ahead,
concerns
Alan.
back in the 1900s was his activities were gaining a lot of popularity, and people were going at one of the concerns that he had was that the public was killing General Sherman with kindness,
Hmm.
and they finally built an elevated walkway and then a balcony around General Sherman so that people were not pressing the soil down and compromising the root system for the tree. But at that time, he'd already found 6 other redwoods that were bigger than General Sherman.
Wow.
And he didn't want, he was really torn about telling people where they were
Sure.
because they couldn't be protected as well as they were able to protect
Well, like
General
the
Sherman.
sure, the bristlecone pine, you're never going to
Yes,
you're not going to know where that oldest Methuselah is, or it would be already be gone. People would go and take a little piece of it,
yes.
one twig at a time, and it'd be gone.
They even took pieces off the Blarney Stone and
And then
Plymouth Rock.
there's these incredible, right, I heard about that. There's some trees down in Venezuela. They were just pretty much known by the locals that are very ancient and super, super huge. Have you heard about those, Hannah?
Mm-mm.
Oh, they're in a
Oh, wait,
rainforest.
maybe I did. Yeah, maybe someone shared
There was
that.
a report by a botanist who was really afraid to talk about them, but he said, I have to tell people about it or they're going to be damaged further because people get to go up and touch them and walk around them. So it's disturbing their roots. These
There's
things
a
are massive.
there's a
It's some kind of a
species.
cypress, some kind of cypress.
We have the same problem with caves.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Some locations secret because the people love them to death.
That's the problem.
there's also a eucalyptus tree down in Tierra del Fuego that's
Mm,
white
yeah.
eucalyptus
Oh,
Mm.
and
wow.
they're centuries old. and they grow like a millimeter a year. It's just totally hostile environment. You can't imagine
Yeah.
you could have these trees that
Well,
are.
sometimes it's not about how tall they are, it's total mass, the volume, the
Yeah.
biomass, correct, Hannah?
Yeah.
Some of them will stop growing in height and just get wider and wider.
Mm-hmm.
See
We
that
actually
in
have Steve Sillett has a neat paper. I can't remember the title exactly, but remember how we talked about a crown versus a canopy? He has a redwood tree crown that is a canopy. So it's a single redwood tree that has like so many
Oh,
reiterations that
wow.
its whole being
Yeah.
is its own complex
Yeah.
canopy. I think
Yeah.
it was one of the
Mm.
most complex ones that they mapped. So I
Well,
just love that.
we do have a place near where you are currently living that we would maybe should tell you about, which was called the Lost Creek Grove of Russ Jolly's. One of his favorite campgrounds is near Underwood. I don't know if
Oh,
Susan Saul wants to talk about that right now. She's still in the meeting, but she has taken us there to this place, and it was one of the last places in the Giverpin show that was an island. He saw it from up when he was up on a mountain, right, Susan? Mount Hamilton or something. Do you have a story to tell us about this, Susan?
No, I think wandering around in the woods
He just
and
found.
found this grove that hadn't been burned, so it's got really old trees in it. And he wanted to make sure that lots of people knew about it so the Forest Service would never plant a timber sale in there. It's in the Wind River drainage just south of the Big Lava Bed.
oh, okay.
Lost Creek starts north of the Big Lava Bed. It goes underground through the Big Lava Bed, and then it emerges again and goes down into the Wind River near Willard.
Okay.
And so he created his own little trail system in there, and he had a place where he'd take people to camp in there under the big trees. And so I did take members of the Portland chapter there a few years ago on a field trip to see it.
Oh,
When's the last? I'm wondering how, with all of this extra rain and stuff, if no one's really tending that trail the way he did, is it pretty overgrown by now?
Well, a lot of the trails under the closed canopy of the forest, so it doesn't have a lot of undergrowth in places.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't been there this year, but I know there are locals. I mean, Russ told everybody about it, and he took anybody who was willing there because he felt the only way you save a place is you build a big fan club for it. And so if the Forest Service ever planned a timber sale, there'd be a huge outcry against it. I
Do you
know,
think it would?
I was gonna
Would it
say, I
be?
know the previous botanist on the Mount Adams district, Andrea, went in there
Uh-huh.
and checked it out for herself, but she's retired now.
Yeah.
We got a new botanist, we got to start all over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just met him.
Could
But
I,
Susan, do you
Susan,
think I got to ask her a question before she disappears? Just hang on. We're having an annual meeting, and the Portland chapter is for the whole state of the Native Plant Society, and we're going to be in the Gorge. Susan, do you think it would be appropriate and okay if we took a group there as one of our field trips?
Sure. I mean, because you're going to limit the number of people on a field trip.
Right. Because Jason knows how to get there, and Roger, and a few other people.
A number of people have been there with me, including you, I think.
Yes, yes. I could
yeah.
never find it again if I had to go try to find it.
Oh, I know,
barrel.
it's really hard to
The
find. So
barrel's still there.
I have
The barrel.
GPS. I have GPS, the trailhead to find it along the road because that's the hardest part.
Yeah. Yeah, Lisa says, is the barrel still there? That was kind of our landmark.
I don't know. I haven't driven that road. It was the roads, the potholes are so bad on that road, they'd swallow my car. So that's another protection for it. The road's really bad.
That's true. They don't improve that road. Alan, did you want to say
I
something?
just want to compared to the Grove of the Patriarchs in Ohanapekosh
Yeah.
in Mount Reed. Is
Right.
it similar to that as far as
Oh, no,
diversity
they're
and
not that
size?
big. No, they're not that big. It doesn't get that much rain in the Giverpin show right there in
Yeah.
that section of the gorge. but it's just that so much was logged all around. It was a miracle. This man, Russ Jolly, was a member of the Portland chapter, but he spent half of his life just tromping around in the gorge because he actually was a big fan of Mount St. Helens. And when it blew up, he was upset. So he just tromped over, went down to the gorge instead. And lucky for us. So
No,
I think
I was going to say there are really big trees in there, but I don't know that anybody's ever cored them to age them. I'm not aware of it. So,
probably not.
they're several hundred years old. They're big, and I bet they've got good canopy. And I bet if we walked around in there, we'd find a bunch of those lichens.
Well, that's why I was thinking we should take Hannah and let Hannah climb one and see what's up there. It's really amazing, Hannah. If you're interested, we can arrange a private
And
hike.
then speaking of fires, because that Underwood fire was close, but I don't think it headed north over the ridge down into
No.
the Underwood fire stayed down in the gorge.
Yeah.
Lost Creek is far enough away; it was not affected.
Good.
I emailed Susan immediately when I heard about that damn fire. Do you live near Underwood now, Hannah?
I do. Yeah, I'm on
Yes.
the Washington side of the gorge. I live in Bingen, if you guys know where that
Oh,
is.
Benton.
Yeah.
Sure.
Below White
Okay.
Salmon. But yeah, the
Uh-huh.
Underwood fire was scary because it was coming fast on the inside of the gorge
The
part
wind
there. But
was.
yeah, I think they got it before it crossed the road up above.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it went across the Underwood Highway though.
Did it in some
Yeah,
spots?
it did burn 20 houses.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
that
what
was
I was told. I was in the gorge that day too, out in Mosier, and saw it from somebody's deck. And I'm like, that doesn't look good. That's on the Washington side. So anyway, we just are so happy that you are our neighbor. And are you going to be in at Reed for one more year? And then what's your plan after that?
I'm not sure after this. Yeah, I have one more year of teaching at Reed, and then we'll kind of see what happens from there.
Well, we really hope to see you at some of our events again. Maybe come and sit in on one of our things. I'm going to make you an honorary member or something. I'll send you our newsletter, especially
please do.
if we do any things that are out near your way, which we're in the gorge all the time, actually.
Oh, good. I would love that. Yeah, if you could send the newsletter, that'd be great.
I will. I'll send you the list of the hikes, and we have our own sort of a Google Calendar that lists all the hikes
Okay, wonderful.
that can be downloaded. Okay, thanks to everyone.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank
We ought to
you.
close and let this woman go
Thank
to
you.
sleep.
Yeah.
Get ready
Thank you,
for school
everybody.
tomorrow.
Yeah, have
Bye-bye.
a good evening.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Good night.